The Crusades were a war of faith, a holy mission, a clash of civilizations, the clash between Christendom and the Islamic world. You've heard of the kings, the knights, the sieges and the swords, but you haven't heard this. Buried in forbidden texts and ignored by mainstream history lies one of the darkest traditions of the Crusading era, the collection of hands. Some knights didn't just kill their enemies. They marked them. They claimed them. They kept their hands as tokens of righteousness or warnings to the next. It wasn't legend. It wasn't war propaganda. It was a ritual. And now, historians are uncovering chilling truths buried beneath centuries of holy dust and silence. The hands they kept as trophies, the Crusades' darkest secret. We were told the Crusades were a simple story. Christians vs. Muslims. Good vs. evil. A call from the Pope. A long journey to reclaim Jerusalem. But real history is rarely so clean. The First Crusade was born from desperation. Europe was fractured. Armies were starving. Papal influence was waning, and what began as salvation quickly twisted into something else. Crusaders didn't just fight Muslims. They slaughtered Jews in the Rhineland. They attacked Orthodox Christians in Constantinople. They even turned on each other for land, titles, and power. The holy cause became, for many, a holy excuse. And amidst the chaos, some sought trophies, not of gold, but of flesh. Chroniclers of the 12th century describe grisly scenes. They cut down the heathens and took from them their grasping hands. To remind all who had raised sword against Christ, Frater Guillem, 1187. This was not metaphor. Hands were kept, preserved, displayed, sometimes buried in church walls, sometimes shipped home. We're not just talking about battlefield mutilation. We're talking about systematic severance, used in punishment, used in ceremony, used to prove holy duty. But why hands? Why not heads, or swords, or shields? The answer lies in belief. By the Second Crusade, the tide had changed. What started as a mission of deliverance had become a brutal economy of holy war. With every victory came titles. With every campaign, spoils. And for some knights, spoils didn't mean land. It meant proof. Across the Holy Land, whispers grew of a secret practice, a gesture not for victory, but for validation. A severed hand from a heathen, or even a disobedient Christian ally, was taken as a mark of absolution. Bring it to your commander, get your coin. Bring it to your bishop, get your blessing. In parts of France, Italy, and the German states, stories traveled back of boxes filled with hands arriving from Antioch and Acre. Not burned, not buried, preserved. These weren't battle trophies, they were spiritual tokens. And in a time where indulgences could be bought, the severed hand became a kind of currency of grace. But even within the ranks of Christendom, not everyone agreed. Some clergy denounced the act as pagan relic hunting. Others feared that the lines between justice and butchery were disappearing. Yet the practice continued, not because it was ordered, but because it was rewarded, and where rewards exist. Rituals followed. By the mid-1100s, some orders began assigning value to certain hands. A noble Muslim's hand earned double. A heretic priest's hand displayed publicly. And if a crusader was caught fleeing battle or questioning orders, sometimes his hand was taken, not by the enemy, but by his own. It was discipline. It was doctrine. It was terror dressed in faith. And by the Third Crusade, everyone from Richard the Lionheart to common foot soldiers knew that the hand was more than a weapon. It was a message. Why the hand? Why not heads? Why not swords or shields? Why did some crusaders march across continents? Just to return with someone's hand? To understand that we have to look deeper, not into war, but into ritual. In medieval Christian belief, the hand was sacred. It symbolized power, vows, oaths, justice, betrayal. It was the part of the body through which action flowed. You prayed with your hands. You killed with your hands. You swore to God with your hands. And if you sinned, your hands carried the stain ... So to sever a hand was to sever a legacy. It wasn't just vengeance. It was cleansing, removing the part that sinned, claiming the part that fought, owning the power of the enemy. Certain orders even performed purification rituals before burying or displaying the hands. They would anoint them with oil, bind them in cloth marked with the cross, whisper prayers of forgiveness and domination, not for the victim, but for the knight, to bless his violence, to sanctify his trauma, to keep his soul clean, even while his hands were not. Some orders took it further. In the mountains of Anatolia, an old hospitaller archive references the Chapel of Hands, a place where knights confessed not with words but with offerings. There, 100 hands lined the wall. For each, a knight wept, and left absolved Brother Ariac, 1223. What began as battlefield savagery evolved into ritual, a cycle of violence, repentance, and repetition. And it wasn't just enemies. Some knights took the hands of fallen comrades, not out of malice but memory, wrapped them in prayer cloths, carried them across deserts, buried them in home chapels, because in their minds, it wasn't just a hand ... It was a promise. You fought beside me. You died beside me. And now, a part of you returns with me. This was devotion twisted by war, holiness entangled with horror. And like all rituals, it became tradition. Ritual gave it meaning. Doctrine gave it permission. But some men made it legacy. These were not nameless warriors. They were famous knights, barons, commanders, men immortalized in the annals of the Crusades. And they collected hands like medals. During the Third Crusade, one name struck fear into the hearts of defenders from Acre to Jaffa, Sir Armand de Villiers. He was knighted under Richard the Lionheart, a brilliant tactician, a devout Catholic, and a man known to carry a leather pouch filled with severed hands. He claimed it was for balance. For every knight of Christendom he lost, he took a hand in return. Chroniclers say he once nailed 37 hands to the gates of a Saracen fortress to negotiate terms, and when that fortress surrendered, his men found a shrine dedicated not to God, but to his victims. They were not trophies, he once wrote. They were receipts. In 1211, a breakaway faction of the Knights Templar formed a rogue order known only in secret texts as the Crimson Hand. They weren't sanctioned by Rome, but they carried the cross. They followed Crusades east, but also turned westward. And they believed that the hand was the seat of evil. To cut it is to cleanse. To keep it is to bind. Crimson doctrine, recovered fragment. They didn't just collect hands. They burned them in ritual. They wrote with their blood. And they were erased from Templar records by 1 to 30. Officially, they never existed. Back in Europe, one of the most infamous figures tied to this practice never even fought in the Holy Land. His name was Conrad of Swabia, a nobleman, a financier of the Fourth Crusade, and a man with a dark obsession. According to the writings of his steward, Conrad purchased over 80 severed hands from returning knights. He commissioned elaborate boxes, some gold-leafed, others wrapped in relic cloth. He claimed they were artifacts of holy vengeance. He displayed them in a locked tower room open only on Easter. Some believed he was mad, others feared he was a collector of souls. So where was the church in all of this? Some bishops spoke out. Some scrolls were burned. But most stayed silent, because while the hands were grotesque, the victories were divine. And as long as the Crusaders marched, no one wanted to ask where the relics came from. Not all orders that marched under the cross survived. Some fell in battle. Others were erased on purpose, their records burned, their banners outlawed, their names buried. But the hands they left behind still speak. The Order of Sanctum Manus, the Holy Hand. First referenced in a papal letter dated 1196, the Order of Sanctum Manus was a small but elite group of knights stationed along the Syrian frontier. They weren't known for victories. They were known for punishments. Captured enemies, Muslim and Christian alike, were ritually mutilated, hands removed, then nailed to monastery doors as warnings. They speak no words, yet they command obedience. Sanctum Manus Rulebook, Fragment 2. The Vatican condemned the order by 1212, but not for violence, for heresy. They had begun using hands to divine the future. Palm lines were studied, fingers burned in rituals. Some knights claimed they could read God's will through twitching tendons. By the time they were disbanded, fewer than 30 remained. Their leader, Master Ayler, disappeared. Some say he escaped to Cyprus. Others, that his followers still performed the hand rites in secret. In the heart of Bohemia, another order grew not from power, but from decay. They called themselves the Ossuary Brotherhood. Formed by lay monks during the Fourth Crusade, they did not fight. They collected bones, limbs, hands, not just from battlefields, but from plague pits, from martyrdom sites, from mass graves left behind by other crusaders. In their theology, the hand represented unfinished faith. It was the part of the body still reaching for God even in death. Their cathedrals were lined with walls of hand bones arranged into intricate patterns. And their libraries? Filled with parchment made from human skin. A man's soul is not in his eyes. It is in his grasp. Ossuary Sermon, 1245. When papal inspectors arrived in 1253, they found 2,000 hands sealed beneath the altar. No names, no prayers, just bones. Of all the forgotten orders, none is more mysterious than the Knights of St. Igretas. Their symbol, a flaming hand. They served during the Children's Crusade when thousands of children were led to the Holy Land, and few ever returned. Igretas was said to be a knight who refused orders to attack a Muslim city filled with civilians. For this, he was excommunicated and executed, but those who followed him took his cause and turned it into something darker. They believed each hand taken in mercy, each life spared, had to be replaced by a hand offered in penance. So they burned their own. Self-mutilation became ritual. So did revenge. By 1300, they were branded heretics and burned alive, ironically, by the same church that had once funded their crusade. Their ashes, scattered at sea, but their story, etched on the walls of a cliffside monastery in Sicily, visible only when the tide pulls away. Why were these orders buried by history? Because they were inconvenient. They broke the narrative. They showed a version of Christianity too close to the cultic, too wrapped in blood, fear, and bone. The myth of the Crusades needed heroes. These knights were reminders of how faith can fracture into fanaticism. In the end, the orders died. But the relics, those hands, still turn up in ruins, in church vaults, even in private collections. Some are dismissed as relic frauds. Others are simply sealed away again, unlabeled, unclaimed, unwanted. When we think of churches, we think of sanctity, of grace, of forgiveness. But scattered across Europe and the old Crusader states are churches that tell a different story, a story written not in scripture, but in bone. Built in the 13th century by a splinter group of Crusader monks, the Chapel of St. Lazarus was a place of pilgrimage, but not for healing. It was said that pilgrims came to confess by witness, kneeling not before saints, but before rows of preserved hands. They lined the walls like judgment, their fingers curled in silent accusation. Brother Pio, 1311. Local legend claimed each hand belonged to a fallen warrior of the faith, but scholars who examined the site in the 1800s found hands of women and children among them. Some still had rings on their fingers. Others bore branding marks suggesting they had been prisoners, not soldiers. The chapel was shuttered by papal order in 1349. But even today, locals say you can still hear knuckles tapping on stone. In the silence, not all sites were Christian. In the city of Aleppo stands the ruins of a once grand mosque, partially destroyed in war. Locals call it the Crimson Mosque, not for bloodshed, but for what was hidden within its walls. When restoration teams entered in 1999, they uncovered a sealed vault behind the eastern Qibla. Inside, 2 chests, both filled not with relics, but with hands. The chests were Ottoman in design, but the hands were far older. Carbon dating revealed some dated back to the late 1100s. Many bore Crusader tattoos, and one had a crude Latin inscription carved into the bone. He raised it against the Lord. Now it stays raised for eternity. Why were they here? Some theorize the mosque's original builders kept the hands as tokens of humiliation, proof of Crusader defeat. Others believe it was a gesture of mercy. The hands were spared, even if their owners were not. In the forests of Westphalia, Germany, sits a little-known relic site, a forgotten church turned ossuary, dedicated to Saint Liborius, the patron of those suffering from illness and of penitence. Visitors report seeing a specific display, a throne made entirely of hand bones. 300 hands, some child-sized, all bleached, cleaned, and arranged in perfect symmetry. At its center, a wooden plaque that reads, Vox Manus Dei, the hand is the voice of God. No one knows who built it. No documents remain. But the throne has never been removed because every time someone tries, the building floods, or burns, or both. Locals call it the throne that should not be touched. Many relics have been destroyed, lost to time, war, or secrecy. But not all. In 2018, a private collection in Vienna was raided. Hidden behind a false wall in a Baroque library were 42 preserved hands, some wrapped in Crusader flags. They were sold illegally by a collector who claimed they were artistic representations. DNA evidence later confirmed they were real. Other discoveries are more subtle. A church in Sardinia with a stained glass window of a knight holding a severed hand to the sky. A Romanian monastery whose altar was built on a foundation of skeletal hands. An Irish cathedral where a mummified hand is locked in a bell tower, chained shut since 1612. These aren't just places of death. They're places of memory, of pain so deep it was carved into holy places, of beliefs so twisted by blood that bone became more sacred than scripture. They remind us that even faith, especially faith, can leave scars. Scars we build temples around. Scars we worship. Ask the average historian about severed hands in the Crusades, and you'll hear the same thing. It's probably symbolic. It's just medieval metaphor, those records. Likely exaggerated, but what if they're wrong? What if the truth was never lost, just buried? When Rome reasserted its control in the late 14th century, it began cleaning house. Doctrinally, architecturally, historically. Papal archivists were ordered to reclassify texts from rogue orders. Many documents referencing ritual mutilation were sealed in secret vaults or destroyed. Let not the faithful be burdened with tales that wound the glory of Christendom, Decree of Anagni, 1374. Even respected chroniclers like Fulcher of Chartres and William of Tyre were silently edited and later reproductions. In the margins, words like manus, digitus, and trophum were crossed out. In some editions, entire paragraphs vanished. By the Renaissance, the story had changed. Where once the severed hand was a religious ritual, now it was literature, a symbol, a metaphor for sin, or justice, or divine punishment. Artists turned the image into allegory, bloodless, sanitized. The violence became philosophy. The horror became myth. And generations of students learned only the version deemed appropriate by those in power. But not all accepted the sanitized version. In 1892, an eccentric German historian named Karl Eschweiler uncovered a set of forgotten monastery logs in W. Arsberg. They detailed inventory records from the Crusades. One entry listed 7 right hands of infidels, sealed in ash and oil. To be sent to Bishop Reinmar, Eschweiler published his findings. The academic community laughed him off. Some accused him of forgery. Weeks later, his home burned down. The logs were lost. He never published again. Today, dozens of museums around the world house unknown relics from the Crusades. Unlabeled bones, discarded scrolls, preserved tissue marked as cultural artifact, but when researchers request testing, they're denied. One anonymous curator admitted, "We have things we don't talk about because if we did, we'd have to rewrite everything." The severed hand has become a horror trope, a jump scare, a prop. Think about it: how many movies feature a severed hand crawling across the floor? How many video games treat it as an unlockable relic? The symbol has been stripped of its origin. Its ritual power turned into entertainment. And maybe that's the final cover-up. Not by fire, not by silence, but by laughter. This isn't about just bones. It's about truth. Because if faith could justify the taking of hands, if churches once honored violence with shrines of flesh, then what else have we misunderstood? What else have we buried under symbols and stories and stained glass? And why do these hands keep returning? In ruins, in vaults, in dreams. Perhaps because they were never meant to be forgotten. For centuries, we've told a story about the Crusades. A story of faith, of valor, of kings and crosses, of holy wars waged in the name of righteousness. But beneath that polished tale lies something darker, something not taught in textbooks, something buried beneath relics, ruins, and fear. The hands. This wasn't just a war of swords. It was a war of symbols, and in that war, the hand became everything: a weapon, a warning, a currency, a confession, cut from enemy, taken from friend, offered to God. These weren't trophies. They were rituals. They were prayers made in violence, devotion shaped by dismemberment. And what does that say about the men who wielded such faith? About the institutions that looked away? About the history we still recite? Historians will debate the details. Some will call this myth, others a misunderstanding of medieval practice. But when bones reappear in sealed chapels, When scrolls whisper of penance by blade, when old churches still bear the scars, we are forced to ask, what is real? What was erased? What was made holy? Only because it was victorious? VNBN McNistory is written by the hand that survives. Whether buried in ossuaries, sealed in glass, or painted in forgotten corners of cathedrals, the hands remain. They reach from history with fingers outstretched not in vengeance, but in testimony. They ask us not to be afraid of what they are, but to be afraid of why we stopped seeing them. To remember the severed hands of the Crusades isn't to shame the past. It's to understand it. To know that even the holiest missions can be poisoned by fear, pride, and dogma. That violence, once wrapped in ritual, doesn't disappear. It mutates. It hides behind flags, creeds, and myths, until someone is brave enough to look beneath the altar again. They called it righteousness. They called it glory. But in the end, for thousands of forgotten souls, all that remained was a hand. And that's what they kept as trophies. If this story moved you, unsettled you, or simply made you curious, share it. Because the truths buried in history are only dangerous when no one dares to uncover them. Subscribe for more untold history, more forbidden relics, more truths in shadow. Comment below. What do you think the hands truly meant?